Hello, I want to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, whatever you believe, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll. This is Adult Religious Studies offering at the UULA Church. Let's turn this up then. I don't know if I can. Is that better? Nope? Yes?
Yeah.
All right. So, my name is James Carroll, and I'm teaching a series on for the adult education course on comparative religion. For the most part, we've every once in a while taken a dive into religious studies in general. We're going to do that again today, and then next month we'll probably come back to Buddhism, which we're in the middle of. But I wanted to take a moment and clean my palate and talk about something a little different today because it's an interesting subject for me. I want to also remind you that the course webpage is online, sites.google.com/view comparative religion. And if you go there, there's a list of the classes and and you can get all the links to the past lectures and the recordings of the past lectures and that sort of thing. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. There's also a calendar, etc. So today's topic is the secularization hypothesis. I want to talk about what that is in sociology circles and what it means and what the evidence for and against it is and how this kind of works. So first, some definitions, and the definitions are really important. The first is secularism, and I want to differentiate that from secularization. So let me tell you how I'm using those terms differently. Secularism is an advocacy for a secular state, for a secular position. And so that's not what I'm doing here today. If you believe, that's fine. If you don't believe, that's fine. I'm trying to step out of advocacy for either view. Secularism is the position that pushes a specific view, that the world would be better off if it became secular, if we got rid of religion, etc. Secularization, on the other hand, is a social phenomenon where religion loses some of its adherence and some of its social, what's the right way to say this? It's import, its power. It loses some of its power, political power, social power, etc., in a given society. So when we see that happening, that's just something to describe. It happened or it didn't happen. And that's secularization, when a society becomes more or less secular. The reason to distinguish them is very important because people make the mistake of taking those who discuss secularization as a human phenomenon worth describing and accuse them of secularism, which some of them may be believers in secularism, some of them may be not, but it's used as a way to dismiss without adequate thought what sociology has to say about secularization. And so I want to distinguish between the two and say describing the human phenomenon isn't the same thing as advocating for it or even saying it's a good thing. I mean, you can make a rational argument that the decline in religion is a bad thing for society if you want. You could look at the work of Emil Durkheim or some of these other sociologists and make that argument from a sociology perspective or from a position of faith. But either way, that's not a reason to accept or reject secularization as something that has happened in society. More controversial, though, than that secularization has happened is the secularization hypothesis, which is a specific theory about how secularization happens and why it happens and whether it will happen in a given society. And it's especially that prediction into the future that gets a lot of pushback, as it should, because when we make predictions, sometimes we're wrong. Okay, so what is the secularization hypothesis? Well, there's two of them, at least, and the problem is different people will define it differently, which adds to the confusion and makes it easy to strawman. I can come up with a definition of the secularization hypothesis that is obviously false. There also might be a definition that's true. What is it? Well, the broad secularization hypothesis that sometimes shows up in the popular literature is that it is inevitable that the world is becoming more secular and that God is dead, religion is dying, and just give it some time and we'll all be rational, scientific, rejectors of the supernatural and all things religious. And religion is dead, and if it's not dead, it's dying everywhere we look, and we're secularizing. That's obviously false, and I think I'll show why that's false. But there's also a more narrow definition, and there's stuff in between too. But the narrow definition, the one that sociologists modern sociologists tend to use. Some of the early sociologists muddy the waters by giving more broad definitions. But the narrow, today's sociologist kind of definition of this is the belief that, and the hypothesis that, modern societies, and we'll define modern in a minute, tend to have a secularizing influence on their culture. So if you have a modern society, you could predict by this theory that there would be a pressure towards less religious influence in the society and the culture. And that's the narrow secularization hypothesis. It's much harder to refute because it is more narrow, and there's some interesting evidence for it. So let's talk about that. So first we have to figure out what in the world we mean by modern. Because if you don't define that, you can make it mean anything you want. And then, of course, you can make the theory either true or false, depending on how you define it. My favorite, though, is from psychology. It's not actually from sociology. It's from psychology. And it's called the weird theory. Jonathan Haidt is an advocate of it, but it's used by many others. And that is, modern societies are weird. And we want to use that acronym because it drives home the point that this is abnormal. In human history, this is not something we normally see. It's not normal in our past, and it's not normal just in the world. These societies that are weird are rare. Not only are they haven't happened in the past, they're also not very many of them, frankly. And most society is not like this. And we don't recognize that because we live inside our own weird bubbles. But a weird society is Western. It's educated, it's industrial, it's rich, and it's democratic. And frankly, only half of the United States fits that mold, which is why we have so much political polarization between the urban and the rural parts of America, because the educated, upper class, intelligentsia is living in a different world from the rural people in the heartland of America. And so recognizing this idea of weird is important. The problem is that the weird monogram misses some very important parts that are essential for the secularization hypothesis specifically, and that is this idea of individualistic and diverse or pluralistic. These kind of modern societies tend to be individualistic, they tend to be diverse and pluralistic. So here's the theory. Being educated, industrial, rich, individualistic, diverse, pluralistic tends to create a society in which religion has less influence, politically, culturally, etc. That's the hypothesis. And the question is it true? And if it is, what are the mechanisms that make that happen? And what is the evidence to support the fact that it is true? So once you define Western, you have to figure out how to measure religion and its influence. If it's going to decline in society, you have to measure it. Well, these are the three B's, and this is the best way I know to measure religion's influence. And that is belief, belonging, and behavior. What do people do that is religious, like pray, read their scriptures, go to Sunday school, hang out in my class, which is bizarre because if you answered the Pew survey and you came to my class, you probably would mark that you had come to some sort of a religious study group, and yet we're Unitarian Universalists and my class is incredibly secular. So who knows? But you measure behavior, like how often you read, how often you pray, how often you go to services, how often you go to study groups. You measure behavior, and then you measure belief. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in heaven? Do you believe in hell, etc.? And then you measure belonging. What group do you belong to? There's identity. Do you identify with a religious group, and how important is that identity in your life? Are there other identities that are more important? Maybe your identity is a Republican, or your identity is a Democrat, or your identity as a gay person, or your identity as a woman. Maybe those identities are more important than your identity as a Methodist. Right? So you can ask people whether they identify as a religious organization, and then how strongly that identity frames their sense of self in comparison to the other things they identify with. And again, you can begin to see how the secularization hypothesis works. The idea is, in these weird modern societies, there are other identities available. And you can almost argue that identity politics in the United States is like this replacement for religion. There's another identity people can... in the past, people would identify with religions, and then religions would argue. Right? I think of the Burned Over District and the Great Awakenings. Well, now, instead, we identify with Republican, Democrat, or whatever, and we argue. And so that is secularization, because what we've done is we've taken this element of belonging from the religious sphere and we put it in the political sphere. And that would be evidence that secularization has happened in the United States. Again, it's not an advocacy for that. It's just saying you can see that it's happened. That's an evidence for it. So belief, behavior, and belonging are what we're going to try to measure. And then we need to figure out if these things are going up or if they're going down. Are they growing or not? To grow or not to grow, that is the question. Well, you can measure that several ways. You can ask questions in surveys multiple times and ask the exact same question over and over and see if the trend is up or if the trend is down. But once the other thing you can do, even if you only have a single survey, is you can look at a group that answers a certain way. Say they answer the survey and say they don't have a religious identity. They're the nuns. Well, what is their birth and fertility rate? What is their death rate? What is their age distribution? How many of them switched from a previous religious identity to that religious identity? And how many of them switched from that identity out of that identity to a different one? That's religious switching. And then you can ask questions about migration. If people are moving from areas with one set of identities into areas with another, they'll take some of that with them. So if you follow those trends, you can make not only measure what's happening right now, you can make some predictions into the future. Because if you know age, death rate, fertility rates, and age distribution, you can make some prediction of what will happen. Older people will die, younger people will grow up, people in a certain age group will have kids, and there'll be more of those people. If they're predominantly older and there aren't very many young people, there will be less of them in the future. So if there's not a lot of youth in the Unitarian Universalist Church, there's probably going to be less of us in the future than if you have a church with a lot of youth in it. That's a way you can take an immediate snapshot and make some predictions as to how this will move into the future. Yeah, go ahead.
So somebody raised a Methodist might be less likely to stay a Methodist than somebody raised a Mormon might be to stay a Mormon, right?
Yeah.
So how do you factor that in?
So what the question was that some people, if you're talking about religious switching, some people raised a Methodist might be more likely to stay a Methodist than Mormon. Actually, it's the other way around. Mormons are more likely to stay Mormon than a Methodist is to stay a Methodist. But how do you factor that in? Well, it becomes a very complex model, but you can actually look at, and Pew has asked this question repeatedly, what is your current religious identity and what religious identity were you raised with? And so we can look at the number of people exiting an identity, and we can also look at the number of people entering that identity. And we can kind of see that rate from the switching. So the switching turns into a rate of entrance and exit that you can measure. Now, Mormons are less likely to switch out, and when they switch out to a specific subgroup. More of them become a nun than become an evangelical, for example. So they have an interesting demographic when they switch out. But they also have a missionary program that causes more people to switch in. So you can look at all of that. Right? And so that's part of what we're looking at when we talk about religious switching. We want to look at the age demographics, but we also want to look at the switching. So what are the global patterns? When you take all this into account, you get some patterns. And so I'm going to put these patterns up, talk about them, then we're going to do the evidence, then I'm going to put up, and we're going to talk about them again. So I'm giving you the answer before we start. But this is kind of the answer. What's happening? First, weird societies are growing less religious. And there was some argument that the U.S. was an outlier, and we still are an outlier. We live kind of on a different trajectory than some of these other nations, but as we will show, the U.S. has now joined the rest of the weird countries in experiencing intense religious decline. Weird societies are having fewer children. We have a low birth rate. Whatever it is about modern weird societies creates a decline in religion, it also creates a decline in birth rates. And the world is growing more religious, not less. At the same time that the world is getting more modernized, it's also getting more religious. That looks like a contradiction in the hypothesis. We'll talk about whether it is or not in a minute. But the percent of people that are religious is actually going up, not down. That is primarily driven by the birth rate thing we just discussed. The countries that are becoming secular are having less kids. The countries that are fiercely religious are having more kids. And there is a strong, but despite that, there is a strong correlation between religious influence in a society and how modern or weird that society is, which would seem to support the hypothesis. which means the broad hypothesis, that the world is just secularizing, is false. I mean, if it's going to happen, it may happen in the future, I don't know, but it's not happening now. So the world is getting more modern, the world is getting more religious at the same time. So that seems to contradict the hypothesis, and yet there is a remaining correlation between how religious it is and how modern it is on this weird scale, which would seem to support the hypothesis. We have this contradiction and this support. It's possible for both of them to make some sense if you think that the main driver for this difference is the birth rate. And so we'll talk about that, right? You could have a society that's gotten slightly more modern and therefore slightly less religious, have slightly less religious influence, and yet it has a bigger birth rate than the countries that are further along in that path, and that is enough to cause this idea that religion is growing more, the world is growing more religious at the same time. Those both can happen at once. I should also point out that the other critique of the secularization hypothesis is that the people who created that hypothesis were looking at Europe. Europe was the first set of countries to go through this experience. So they were looking at Europe. And there's almost a racist, prideful, almost colonial thing going on where they think, eventually the world is all going to look like Europe. And so that is a critique of this hypothesis, so that we have to ask the question, is this really going to happen in these other countries just because it happened in Europe? And America's an interesting test case because we were an outlier and now maybe we're not. But we also have these but America's a lot like Europe, so then that raises the question, will these other countries really follow suit if they're so different from us? Well, again, if the hypothesis is that certain conditions lead to certain outcomes, if those nations never get those conditions, we wouldn't expect them to have those outcomes, and that's not a contradiction of the hypothesis. And nothing in the hypothesis says that modernization, other than the fact that we've prided ourselves with saying we're the modern ones, right? But other than the fact that we've taken that pride in name, there is nothing in the hypothesis that says that other nations will ever become modern in the weird, pluralistic sense that we've described it. And if they never do, we would never expect them to experience the same secularization. So, again, that's maybe a way to respond to that idea that this is a kind of a Europe first theory. It is, but that's what the theory is about, and so that shouldn't surprise us or bother us. Okay, so what's happening worldwide? These are the trends. This is from the Global Religious Landscape Study. It's done by Pew. It's one of the best. It's not the only one, but it's one of the best kind of demographic trend tracking attempts out there. And this is what they predict. And so if we look at it, we have Christians going from 2.17 billion up to 2.92 billion. So the number of Christians in the world is expected to go up significantly. But the percent of the world that's Christian, it's very important, right, is flat. Well, what's happening? The world is growing at almost the same rate Christianity is growing at. The world's birth rate and growth rate is almost identically matched to the Christian growth rate and birth rate. So if that continues, now whenever you project into the future, you're guessing. What you're really doing is saying, if current trends continue, and I haven't even showed you all the trends they used to create this theory, but they're saying, I'm showing you the end before we start, right? If the current trends continue, we will expect Christianity to grow and to continue to grow at a rate that almost exactly matches population increase. So the percent of the world that's Christian we wouldn't expect it to change. However, the percent of the world that's Muslim is growing very, very rapidly. And this is the sort of number that fuels a lot of the xenophobia and Islamophobia, right? They don't want more of 10% of Europe to be Muslim by 2050. Well, that's what the demographic trend seem to indicates happening, and that creates some of this pushback. But Islam is set to grow. The unaffiliated, we're about 16.4% of the world's population. A lot of that is China. We'll talk about that in a bit. But we are actually set to shrink. The unaffiliated are set to shrink. Why? Well, again, birth rate is the real issue. And then you can see some of these other Buddhisms, etc., down here. So what that means is the world is growing. If the current trends continue, more religious. Why? Well, I've already told you, but the issue is birth rate and growth rate. So Islam is growing very fast at 7.3%. 35% growth is what is expected over this time period from 2010 to 2050. This was written, I think, 2011. So from 2010 to 2050, they're expecting a 35% growth rate in the world population. So Christians, 35%. They're exactly matching the world growth rate. Muslims, 73%. They're growing faster. Hinduism, 34%. Jews, 16, 11, 9, and then you get these unaffiliated. If they grow at a 9% rate, then again, the world becomes more religious through time. So if we look at what's happening with switching, again, it's about birth rate and it's about switching and migration. Remember, those are the things that matter. So let's look at switching first. The unaffiliated are growing through switching. Again, we have the unaffiliated have a low birth rate, but they have a high conversion rate. People are dropping out of religion and they are joining the unaffiliated's ranks at a very rapid rate. So the group that is going to grow the most, predicted through switching, is the unaffiliated. Muslims are also growing through switching. So are folk traditions and this other religion catch-all. Hinduism is going to grow, but not. It's basically flat. The Jews are losing people, but at a reasonably slow rate. Buddhists are also losing people, and the Christians are hemorrhaging. Okay, so that's kind of the current world makeup of where people are going when they convert. And you can break it down by group, like to show you where the Mormons go when they deconvert, and I can show you almost who converts to Mormonism. We've got a lot of this very interesting data that I could spend the rest of my life looking at because I find it fascinating. But this is what we expect to happen through conversion in the next few years. But that's not enough. If you just looked at this, the unaffiliated would grow faster than all the other groups, right? So by switching's perspective, the unaffiliated are growing the fastest. However, the problem is birth rate. So again, the world birth rate is about 2.5%, or is projected to be 2.5% over this time period. And the unaffiliated are about 1.7%. Only Christians and Muslims are above the world's fertility rate, and the Christians are losing people through switching. People are switching out of Christianity, which makes up for that slightly extra birth rate. Not only does the birth rate tell us who's going to grow and who's going to shrink, we can also kind of predict where. And where almost drives it, right? They have a high birth rate in Africa. You look at the religions in Africa, and those are those other religions, the Muslim religions and the Christian religions. And that's where we expect growth in Islam, growth in Christianity, and growth in these folk traditions. And that's because there's a high birth rate in Africa. And that's where some of that's going to come from. So here's kind of the expected growth in different regions. But again, the regions matter only in as much as they drive the different traditions, because the traditions are found predominantly in these different regions. So again, I told you the other thing you can do is you can just look at their age distribution. Age distribution tells you something about fertility rate. Because if you have a young population, they're more likely to have kids because they're in childbearing age. But it's also important because, if you have an old population, the old people die and the young people take their place, and if there aren't a lot of young people to take their place, the group will shrink. You have to take that into account, as well as the switching and the birth rate. You also just have to take their age distribution into account. And when you do that, you'll find, again, the Muslims are the youngest, the Hindus are next, the Christians are next, and the unaffiliated are way down here. So again, all of these trends look like problems for the secularization hypothesis, and this is why we expect the world population to grow. But again, the question I'm going to ask in just a second is this really a contradiction of the hypothesis? Because the hypothesis says that modern societies will have a secularizing influence on those societies. It doesn't say anything about birth rates. And so if we look at the switching, that's the sort of thing we would expect to be driven by the secularization hypothesis. And when we look at where the switching is happening, it's mostly in these modern cultures, except China. China is the weird, well, I shouldn't use the term weird because we used it for something else. China is another outlier because it had secularization forced on it by a communist regime, and a very dictatorial and brutal communist regime that is now starting, it's got all sorts of problems still, I don't want to make a political, but it's starting to ease up on the religious repression at least. And this huge block of unaffiliated people in China are now deciding, well, I'm unaffiliated because I had to be. Is that really what I want? And so there's a lot of interesting religious switching that already happened in China that had nothing to do with the secularization hypothesis, and that is now possibly happening in the other direction because we're kind of relaxing this artificial constraint on it. So China is this outlier. But if you ignore China, the religious switching to the nuns is primarily happening in the weird societies. So we have these two competing trends, and then the question is this trend here, driven by age and birth rate, really a contradiction to the secularization hypothesis or not? Now, I should point out, it would be if this happened in individual countries as well, right? If the birth rate was enough to contradict the religious switching in a Western weird country, then that would contradict the secularization hypothesis because it would cause a secular weird country to become more religious through time. That would be a contradiction. And so, again, that's relevant. And again, I can't, this debate has been going on in sociology for years. I'm not going to solve it today. I just kind of want to give you a taste of what's out there. So this is the birth rate for different religious traditions and its expected change through time. And we can do that because we also believe that the birth rate is going to slow in Africa, etc. So we have to, if we want to predict into the future, we also have to take into account how the birth rate will change through time. And so we have these high birth rates for Islam that's dropping, but we have a higher birth rate for Christianity, but not as high as Islam, and it's also dropping through time, etc. And then we have the unaffiliated that had a low birth rate, and their birth rate is actually it's predicted to rise, but ever so slightly. It's basically flat. And you can see that the birth rate is really the problem. If you project this way out in the future, and if I make a projection like this based on demographics, it's probably going to be true for the next 5 years, 10 years. Because, if you have a certain age number, they're going to die. I mean, you can make that prediction fairly reliably. If I start projecting further than that, all sorts of things can change. There's really no way to be sure you're going to get this right. But if you just project it way out there, Islam will overtake Christianity in the year 2070 and become the world's largest religious tradition. Again, just if trends continue, which we don't know if they will. And all of this has this very interesting caveat and wild card, and that is China. And I'm going to read this from the Religious Landscape, the World Religious Landscape Report. It says China's 1.3 billion people as of 2010 live in very large and global trends. And if they change, they're going to make a huge difference, right? At present, about 5% of China's population is estimated to be Christian, and more than 50% is religiously unaffiliated. That's where most of the unaffiliated are, actually. Because reliable figures on religious switching in China are not available, the projections do not contain any forecast for conversions to the world's most populous country. That's huge. They're not even taking into account switching in China because they don't know what the answer is. And it's going to be a huge driver in all these predictions. If Christianity expands in China in the decades to come, as some experts predict, and there is some evidence for it, by the way, then by 2050, the global numbers of Christians may be higher than projected, and the decline in the percentage of the world's population that is religiously unaffiliated may be even sharper. In other words, China may have an overinflated group of unaffiliated because of the communist enforcement. Now, I've seen all sorts of interesting arguments. There's no reason to expect that these people would adopt a religion that has nothing, to do with their culture now that they're free to do kind of more what they want. It's also possible that China will crack down again. We just don't know. But there is evidence that there's a lot of conversions to Christianity happening in China right now. Religions are reporting conversions in China and congregational growth in China. So we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. In fact, for all I know, Buddhism will take off in China again because at one point it was a highly Buddhist country. I mean, that would completely upend all these predictions. We just do not know. But what we can say in terms of the secularization hypothesis, now, we've mentioned all these kind of trends. We've told you that religion is growing. Does that mean the secularization hypothesis is wrong? Well, if we just take the trends over all these countries, it's very hard to say exactly how Western weird a country is, but you can ask whether its industry is primarily agrarian, industrial, or post-industrial. And the world religious social trend, the world values, what was the name of this? Norris and two researchers, Norris and Eaglehart, in the World Values Survey data, which they organized and took over many years. It's a very good set of data. They divided the world's countries based on their industry into agrarian, industrial, and post-industrial societies, and then they measured things like weekly attendance in religious services and daily prayer, and they have a whole slew of other measures. I only put 2 of them up here. And what you see is trend. The more agrarian the society is, the more religiously engaged and influent, the more power religion has in that society. And the more post-industrial the society is, the less influence religion has in that society, which would seem to support the secularization hypothesis. So my point at this stage is, the world is getting more religious. If you think the world is that we're all going to become atheist moral philosophers and superstition is going away and religion is going away and we don't have to worry about it because it'll be gone, and you're wrong. The world is becoming more religious, not less. However, that is not incompatible with the secularization hypothesis, narrowly defined. And this is the sort of evidence you would point to say that there is maybe some evidence to the secularization hypothesis. So let's go through the global patterns. Weird societies are growing less religious. Is the U.S. an outlier? No, I'll show you that next. We'll do the U.S. next. Weird societies are having fewer children, and the consequence of those 2 trends put together is that the world is growing more religious. But there is a strong correlation between religious influence and how modern a society is. It's very predictive. Now again, causation is not correlation, but the modernization seems to happen first, and the decline in religion seems to happen after. Now, it's possible that causation can go the other direction, right? A fundamentalist religious culture might prevent modernization. So I'm sure, in fact, that it goes both directions sometimes. But in general, the order seems to be modernization followed by secularization. So is the U.S. an outlier? Some people have said that Europe secularized by leaving the churches, and the U.S. secularized by making its churches more secular. We got a bunch of Unitarian Universalist churches in the U.S., and so and that's an exaggeration. But all the U.S. churches have become more liberal, not just the Unitarian Universalists. And so when Steve Bruce tried to defend the secularization hypothesis back in 2010, he was limited, because all he had is data up till 2010, with making this sort of argument. He tried to show that the secularization hypothesis was true because even though a bunch of people in the U.S. still go to church, the churches are far more liberal on almost every point. And he started listing all the points where today they're more liberal than they were in the past. And that's how he defended the secularization hypothesis in the U.S. And he admits that the U.S. is an outlier. But he argues it still is in line and supports the secularization hypothesis. We're just secularizing differently. And that's what he said in, I think it was, 2011? And then time passed, data happened, and this happened. And what I've done here is I have combined, and this is just some of the sources I was able to find this morning. But what I did is I went through all the kind of social surveys I could find, and I put them all in one chart. And you really can't do that. I mean, it's bad kind of sociology, because when you ask a question differently, you get a different answer. Right? So, for example, if I include New Age as a religious option, a bunch of people might choose it who would otherwise choose none if that option wasn't on the list. And you can see those differences. The gray lines here are Gallup. Gallup gets a much lower percent of nuns, none being non-affiliated. Gallup thinks there's a lot less nuns in the U.S. than does Pew. Or the GSS data as well, General Social Survey data. However, they ask different questions. They ask the question differently. They survey different people. They maybe have different biases in their surveys. What matters is the direction. When you repeat the same question, when Gallup repeats the question, they get a trend that has this steep of a line. When the GSS repeats the question, they get a line that's about the same steepness. So does Pew. So we even have this thing from the PRRI American Values Atlas that's right here. This is a different data point. The two yellow points, there's one here, and there's actually another yellow point down here, but it's exactly covered by one of these other points. But these two yellow points are Pew's Religious Landscape Survey, which was a much more intensive and had a higher number of people surveyed. So for others, let me think if I can explain this. The green dots are Pew's political surveys, meaning they've been asking political surveys for years. And every time they ask a political survey, they ask you what religion you are. And the reason they do that is because people's views on abortion depend on their religion. So they'd ask people their views on abortion, and then they would ask them their religion. Or they'd ask them questions about gun rights, and then they would ask them about their religion. Well, you can put all that together, and you get the green dots. And then the blue dot is actually from GSS, which asks about religion. However, twice, Pew went out specifically to discover religion. That's with the Religious Landscape Survey. They did one in 2007 and one in 2014. And those two surveys exactly duplicated the same set of questions, and they have a huge sample size. Unlike these other political surveys that are small, these are big sample sizes, and those are the two yellow dots. And again, you get the same slope from the yellow dots that you get from all the others. Go ahead.
Yes, I assume this is charted against time.
Yes.
Could you point out a couple places we can...
Oh, good Lord. Yeah, the projector doesn't work nearly as well as my screen.
Just a couple places.
Yeah, so this is 1973, or 1970, 75, let's see, on my screen I can read it. 1980, 85, 90, 95, 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020. And so it's in increments of 5 years from 1970 up to 1920. And so in 2011, you can imagine, he was living kind of right in here, and maybe there was a trend towards people becoming less religiously affiliated. We're measuring affiliation. Remember the 3 B's? Belief, belonging. This is the belonging test. And you can imagine when he wrote his book, there was some evidence that the U.S. was, had more nuns in it than it used to. Now there's a lot of evidence. It's growing fast. And in fact, when Pew wrote its prediction, that the Pew also did the global religious landscape survey that I showed you earlier that predicted that religion is growing. When they predicted the nuns, they were right here, and they put them on this slope. They're wrong. For the U.S. Now, there's not enough people in the U.S. to make a difference to their prediction of what's happening globally. But in terms of how many people in the U.S. are switching to the nuns, they're wrong. Of course, what they said made perfect sense in 2011. In 2019, it makes no sense. Right? Their rate of switching towards non-belief is much higher than they predicted. So if you just kind of pull that out, this is what they predicted. Right, and if I just do a random fit to these data points, it's probably going to be up here somewhere. Now, again, I don't know for sure that that's going to happen. But, if I were to make my best guess, I'd be around almost 40% of the U.S., 45% will be nuns by 2050. And they have us around 25% of the U.S. will be nuns by 2050. And they're way off. Yeah?
There seems to be something periodic wave imposed upon this other steady trend, like where the bulges are.
There's a couple things happening in the U.S. The U.S. is highly segregated by, and it's getting less. So, but there was a time when the U.S. was driven by generations, with the bulge of the baby boomers driving kind of generational fluctuations and waves. And so it's possible that this bulge right here is real. It's also possible that this bulge is noise. But we can also try to go back and look at, when it hits. We're looking at 1990, 95. And, if I look at the Mormon data, it just so happens that in 1995, there's also a lot of decrease in their growth rate, suddenly. So, I don't know what happened in 1995, but that may be real, it may not be. But even if it is real, through time it just smooths right out. And the gross trend through time almost ignores these little waves. They come and go. So again, I think the Global Religious Landscape Survey was wrong in its prediction of the number of nuns in the U.S., but again, that's not enough to change their prediction that religion is growing. Okay, so what's happening in the U.S. and what's going to happen? Well, these are the nuns, and this is their age distribution. So here we have 2007 and 2014 were the two dates that Pew did the Religious Landscape Survey, and we can see that 29% were in the age range of 18 to 29, and 32% were in the age range of 18 to 29 in 2014. So in other words, they're young, and they're getting younger, which means they're growing. And they're going to continue to grow. Even if switching stopped, they would grow just because of their age distribution. Right? So the nuns are growing. Let's take that. This is the GSS data. And if we just take this kind of GSS data and plot all of them, it's a little bit of a busy figure. I apologize for that. But we want to put all the religions on there. We get the Jewish down here. Oops. The Jewish are down here. We have this other faiths that includes things like, Buddhists and some of these other outliers. Then we have black Protestants here. They are declining slowly. We have the mainline Protestants that are hemorrhaging. The evangelicals were growing. This is during the age of the televangelists, and they were growing right up till about 1994, and suddenly poof. And the evangelicals have been shrinking ever since, and the Catholics were flat, and now they're maybe in slow decline. Maybe, it's hard to tell. And so you look at this, and you look at this one. This is the only one where you just, the mainline Protestants are going down, and the no religions are going up. And the no religions are mostly coming from, any guesses? The mainline Protestants. So mainline Protestants are the ones who are predominantly switching to the nuns. There are groups from everywhere, right? But the nuns are predominantly driven by the mainline Protestants. Now, I've seen people look at this graph and be really, these are the secularists. They get really excited. Look, religion is getting weaker, and if that's something you champion, great. I mean, whether it's a good idea or not is irrelevant to the class here. But if you champion it, great. But I argue you shouldn't be excited by this picture. If you are a champion of secularization, you should not necessarily be excited by this figure, because what this figure represents is not just secularization, but also polarization. Do you see it? The fundamentalist churches, like the evangelicals, are maybe losing ground, but not much. The moderate Christians are the mainline Protestants, and they're hemorrhaging members. And the unaffiliated are growing, but they're mostly growing from the mainline Protestants. Which means we're getting a society that is increasingly secular on one hand, and that is still fiercely fundamentally religious on the other, and it's creating social distress and polarization and disagreement. And if you think our modern politics have nothing to do with this issue, again, no matter what side of the politics you are on, this polarization is driving a lot of this. Because if we also look at what political persuasion these people are coming from, the Democrats, the nuns mostly live in the Democratic sphere, and the number of Democratic nuns are growing. The number of evangelical Republicans is growing. The percent of Republicans, I should be clear. The percent of Republicans who are evangelical is growing. The percent of Democrats who are nuns is growing. And the result is not just religious polarization, but political polarization, which is damaging to our society on all fronts. So, again, this is a mixed bag. There isn't a clear picture of whatever side you're on, a bright future tomorrow or not, right? You can see problems if you're a religious believer. You can see problems with this, I would hope, if you're a secularist. Whatever you are, I hope you see this and it worries you, because it worries me. So now what's going to happen in the future? We've already showed you that the nuns are young, but what about the rest of these groups? This is their age distribution according to Pew. And what we have here is, 0% at this side, and up to, let's see, this is 70% here, 60% here. So this is the percent of people who are under age 18 to 29, are in the dark blue. And if you look at these numbers, the youngest are the Muslims, even in the U.S., which is what we saw globally too. Islam is young and therefore projected to grow, even in the U.S. The next is Hindu. The problem is Muslim and Hindus are a very small percent of the U.S. population, but they're also the youngest and therefore most likely to grow. But if you grow a very small percent, you still stay a very small percent. Buddhist is also very young, and the unaffiliated are young. In fact, they're the second youngest group. Mormons are in the middle, somewhere near where the Jews are. Mainline Protestants have problems. Jehovah's Witnesses have serious problems based on their age, and so do evangelical Protestants. So, if you look at what I would call the three most fundamentalist groups on this list, are the evangelicals and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. These are the religious fundamentalists. And all of them, the Mormons better than the others, but the other two have very serious kind of demographic problems that are going to lead to, presumably, shrinkage in the near future. So let's talk about those two. Let's look at the evangelicals. If you just take the GSS data that I showed you before that said that the evangelicals were roughly flat, but then you subdivide it into the 20-somethings and just plot the 20-somethings, you get a plot that looks like this. Now the problem is, that's this plot. The problem is Pew doesn't seem to show the same thing, so it's hard to tell exactly what's happening. But the evangelicals, it looks like the number of young people in evangelical circles is not only low, which we know from Pew, but possibly shrinking, which we find from the GSS. And weirdly enough, shrinking at about the same rate as the mainline Protestants. So the mainline Protestants shrank first, but if this is a leading indicator, which I think it is, what it means is the evangelicals are about to follow suit. They're not there yet, but if I'm projecting them into the future, I would predict that they're about to start going down at about the same rate as the mainline Protestants. It's just a matter of time, and because they have this demographic age bomb in their congregations. And they're alienating young people at a very high rate with their homophobia and that sort of thing. Mormons, Pew data shows that they're getting older, right? The percent of young Mormons did shrink. So they have a problem. Their problem just isn't as large as the ones we see in these other groups. But if we look at Mormon growth trends, we have that numbers because they report them. And if I plot, now I did a whole class. This is the first actual statistical class I did was on Mormonism. So I'm going to encourage you to go watch that if you haven't seen it. But I've got all sorts of data on Mormons, but this is the top line number. If I just look at the Mormons as a percent of the world's population, they're almost flat. And if they're growing very slowly as a percent of population. This is their reported numbers. If you look at how many of those are active, they actually peaked back in, surprisingly enough, 2000, just before that, 1995, approximately. That number keeps showing up, doesn't it? Instead, it showed up in the Mormon number too. But around 1995, Mormons peaked as a percent of the world population. So they're still growing, but the world population is growing faster. If you look at where they're growing, this isn't a surprise, is it? Green is places where they've added congregations. Red is places where they've disbanded congregations. In the U.S., they're adding and subtracting about even. They're mostly subtracting along the coast and adding kind of in the heartland. Again, is this surprising to anyone? They're adding some maybe down here, but they're subtracting down in here. They're adding some in Africa. Europe is hemorrhaging. And again, it's a secularization hypothesis. The secularization hypothesis predicts where you would expect growth for Mormonism, and it seems to be about in the places where you would expect. It's also in the places where population growth would cause you to expect that to happen. If I look at Jehovah's Witnesses, they have the largest problem with age demographics, and if I look at their growth rate, They are much more intent in their proselytizing than any other group, including Mormons. Mormons are probably next. But even so, their growth rate is shrinking. So this is their percent growth rate by year. And this is the last one, 2018. And it's, about 1.5%. And you need to be at about 1.2% to break even with world population growth. So the percent of the world that is Jehovah's Witnesses is still going up. But their growth rate is shrinking, and if it continues to shrink, they will hit that break-even point just like Mormons did in the next few years. And they have a huge demographic problem to overcome, and I don't see how they're going to overcome it, and that's going to cause them to hit that breakover point very shortly. Their conversion rate is what saves them right now, and that is also dropping, so all the proselytizing effort. So we go back to this picture. The nuns are growing, the main lines are shrinking, but we believe that the evangelicals are about to start shrinking at about the same slope as the mainline Protestants. So they just started later, which raises an interesting question. Why is it that more demanding religions, they aren't immune from secularization, but they possibly hold on longer? That fundamentalists hold on a little tighter and longer than the more liberal churches. And again, if you use the secularization hypothesis to answer that question, one of the things it says is the reason modern societies lead to secularization is the pluralism. If you have religious freedom, then religion is a choice. And you see and rub shoulders with other good people who are making the same choice or making different choices. And so suddenly it becomes optional. And you see all these other different people doing different things, believing different things, and yet all being good people. And suddenly the importance of religion in your life and in your conception of the world goes down. That's one of the drivers behind secularization. That's one of the theoretical drivers behind the secularization hypothesis. One of the reasons modern societies tend to be less religious. If that's what you think is the driver, what do fundamentalist religious traditions do? They isolate you. They have their homeschools. This is also why was the U.S., I guess I never even kind of gave you the point. The U.S. is secularizing now, right? The nuns are growing. It's doing what Europe did, but we did it many years later. Why did Europe hit first and we hit later? Well, again, the secularization hypothesis would answer that question by saying, in the U.S., it's easier to homeschool. It's easier to have private schools. It's easier to isolate yourself from kind of scientific views of evolution, etc. You don't have to face them in school. You don't have to face other religious traditions in school. And then once you isolate yourself in an insular community that takes care of everything, this is what makes religious community strong. You go to that community and there's your youth group, there's your adult group, there's your study group, there's your Sunday worship group, there's your education group, there's your school, there's your everything. You put everything into that religion, into that tradition, and you live in it. And it puts you in a moral matrix, like the movie The Matrix. You live in a bubble. And when you live in a bubble, it's harder to get out. And in fact, it's the popping of that bubble that is what the secularization hypothesis predicts as one of the drivers. Conservative religious traditions are very good at creating bubbles. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're not allowed to get an education. You're not allowed to have friends who aren't members of your religious insular cult. And so that's one of the ways that fundamentalist traditions survive longer, last longer, and resist secularization for a longer time. It doesn't mean they can do it forever. And so, again, just their age demographics and some of these things indicate that the youth in some of these groups are now starting to say, no, we don't think that way, we don't believe that way, and step away. But they were able to hold on longer. What about the people who step away? Again, now once we decide that the U.S. is an outlier but is going along some of the same trends just later, then the question is, and doesn't contradict the secularization hypothesis, then the question is, which of the secularization hypotheses are right? Is it the narrow or the broad one, right? In other words, are we all turning into atheists? Well, what's happening to the people who are leaving organized religions and no longer claiming that they belong to an organized religion? What do the nuns believe? Well, here's some survey data for the nuns. This is about whether they believe in God. 16.6% don't believe in God. 16.4% says there's no way to find out. These are the atheists and the agnostics, sort of. But 32% believe in some higher power. 4.1% believe sometimes. 11.5% believe but have some doubts. And 19.1% believe with no doubts. They know God exists. They just don't affiliate with a church. So that's actually a pretty good number of atheists and agnostics, frankly. That group is growing in the U.S. population through the nuns. But they are not all atheists. In fact, a very large percent of them still believe in something. And a large number of them are superstitious, go to palm readers, like to frequent New Age yoga shops. A lot of them are still superstitious, dogmatic. But does that contradict the secularization hypothesis? No. It only contradicts it if you believe that they're all supposed to turn into atheists. But that was never what the hypothesis said. The hypothesis said that religion would lose some of its social power, relevance, and cohesion. That's all it said. Right? Human nature is such that we believe funny things. And we're probably not going to stop believing funny things. Some of us believe really funny things, and we can talk about that in a minute. But we're probably not going to stop. So if you think this means that we're all going to become rational philosophers, believing the truth and only the truth through logic and reason, that's not probably going to happen. But if you don't belong to an organized institution, religion becomes less and less important in your life. Because when you ask the nuns how important religion is in their life, even the ones who believe with no doubt tend to say it's not very important to them. So these are people who think God is out there, but don't really spend any time caring. Religion isn't a big driver in their life, and it isn't a big deal to them. And so, again, that's not a contradiction of the hypothesis. That's what the hypothesis said was supposed to happen. Okay. Let's look at relatively few religious nuns believe God is described in the Bible, but most believe in a higher power. So what kind of God do they believe in? They've stopped believing in this kind of personal being, but they still believe in some sort of higher power for the most part, etc. And most agnostics, those with religion as nothing in particular, also believe in a higher power or spiritual force. Atheists obviously don't, but a lot of agnostics and nothing in particular do. But, as I just said, I guess I jumped the gun on my own kind of end line here, but the nuns may still believe, but they are less religious. Religious has less of an impact in their life. And if you just look at the impact in the lives of Americans, period, and split it out by generation, you see a trend, right? Pray daily, 67% of the silent generation pray daily. Only 39% of young millennials do. Attend service weekly, 51% of the silent generation attend service weekly. Younger millennials, 28%. Believe in God, 92% of the silent generation, only 80% of the millennials. But believe in God with absolute certainty, only 71% of the silent generation do that, but only 50% of the young millennials do that. So again, the idea that the U.S. is this outlier that completely avoided secularization is just wrong. Right? In terms of belonging, but also in terms of belief, but also in terms of practice, behavior. Pray daily, go to church. All of that is present in this picture, and you can see generational change is what's driving this trend. The younger people do not believe what their parents believed. And it didn't start with the silent generation, or with the millennials. Millennials often get blamed for this. But it started with Gen X. Right? Gen X raised their children more liberally, and they came out believing even less than Gen X did. And Gen X believed less than the baby boomers did. Each generation believes less than the one before because religion is having a hard time conveying a strong sense of its purpose and urgency to the generations that follow. So again, what's happened isn't that human nature has changed. What's happened is that human nature has been directed into other areas, secular areas. So instead of arguing about religion, we argue about our sports teams, we argue about our politics. Instead of believing in religious superstitions sort of thing, we tend to believe in, instead of believing in religious creeds and dogmas, we tend to have conspiracy theories, and instead of believing in religious healings, we tend to have these superstitions. Those haven't changed, there's been arguments about whether those are going down too. It doesn't. The point is that they haven't gone away, and they don't seem to be going away. In fact, some of them are definitely getting worse. Our political divisions, etc., our belief in conspiracy theories, our tendency to isolate ourselves in social media bubbles, all these things have kind of gotten worse in society. Human nature hasn't changed, but what's happened is it's moved from a religious sphere into a more secular sphere. Not a perfectly secular sphere, but a sphere that is more secular than it was. And so that's what's happened in the U.S., is this movement of the same sort of behaviors, the same tribalism, the same human propensity to not be very logical and rational, but it's moved into a new sphere. So, weird societies are growing less religious. The U.S. is not an outlier. We may have started late, but we're well on our way to doing exactly what happened to Europe, and we think we know why. Weird societies are having fewer children, so the world is growing more religious over time, but there's a strong correlation between religious influence and how modern a society is. And so, again, why? I think I already covered the why kind of as we went, but pluralism is a main driver here, I think. Pluralism undermines your ability to take for granted the nature of your beliefs. And it's also why fundamentalist religions that isolate themselves from pluralism last longer, hold out longer against secularization. Institutions become voluntary associations in competition with each other. The laity gains power, they become consumers, and the priests then have to provide for the consumers what the consumers want, or they'll go somewhere else. And this changes the nature of the state and the state's involvement with religion, and religion loses power because state religious institutions disappear. And religious freedom has to be granted, otherwise you end up with the holy wars of Europe and the Protestant Catholic wars that tore Europe apart. If you have a pluralistic society, you either have to be pluralistically religiously tolerant, or you end up tearing yourself apart in religious conflict, which, by the way, is what we're seeing in the Middle East. Some of the Shia-Sunni divides, etc. So, one more thought here. If you can tie your religious identity to an ethnic identity, then we also find that religion is more sustainable through time. And this is also happening in kind of these tribalistic arguments and fights in the Middle East and elsewhere. Right? If you turn your religion into a tribalistic identity that then you can use to leverage an us versus them disagreement or argument with your next door neighbors, Pakistan and India, say. Hindu and Muslim disagreements, Israel and Palestine. If you can do that and turn those things into religion, into religious parts of your religious identity, then people hold on to that religious identity longer. Because like I said, we are still tribalistic societies. In the US, we just catch on to sports teams and political teams as our tribes. But we haven't been less tribal. If the tribe that you primarily identify is ethnic and religious and you can mix the two, then you end up with a situation where religion is more likely to survive into the future. If you're interested in this subject, I haven't proved the secularization hypothesis. It's a hypothesis. I've shown evidence for it. I've shown even some evidence against it. Religion is growing. It's an interesting trend. There's a lot more you could learn or do or study if you're interested in this topic. Like I said, I've scratched the surface. Some great sources are the Introduction to the Study of Religion by Great Courses. It has a history of the different sociologists who introduced this hypothesis. And you'll see where it came from, why. a lot of them were secularists who believed that secularism was a good thing, and that's part of where it came from, which is, again, why it's accused, why the secularization hypothesis is accused of being promoted by secularists. But not all of them. A great deal of the people after those first few founders were believers. They were believers, and they were just interested in why religion was declining, presumably so they could stop it, in their country. And so there's a lot of people who are proponents of this hypothesis who are now believers. And so again, if you want to know kind of the history of the idea, this is a great place to start. This is a book that has a lot of information about the third world countries and how they are reacting to modernization and secularization, and whether they're secularizing, and their birth rates and how their birth rates are going to change, and all this stuff in kind of the developing world. This is a great place to go for that. If you want a proponent of the hypothesis, this is a great place to go. This is by Steve Bruce. It's called Secularization, the Defense of an Unfashionable Theory. And I should mention, it is unfashionable. A great deal of sociologists reject this hypothesis as colonial, European-centric, and too likely to predict, a future that's probably not going to happen. And they'll do things like point at the growing amount of religious worldwide as contradiction to the theory. Steve Bruce makes the argument kind of that I shared with you today, that that's not actually a contradiction, that's just a birth rate thing. We never said that secular societies would have a high birth rate. We said modern societies would be more secular and also have a lower birth rate. And so that's kind of his argument. He'll defend it, but he'll also point out that it is kind of unfashionable, fell out of fashion for a great deal of time. Again, the recent data in the U.S., I think, gives it new legs. The U.S. was always the outlier people pointed to contradict the secularization hypothesis. And the new data from the U.S., I think, puts the entire theory back on its feet. If you're just looking for data, there's a lot of it out there. The World Values Survey is one place to go. The Global Religious Landscape Survey by Pew is one place to go. Again, they were wrong about how fast the nuns were growing in the U.S., but the Religious Landscape Studies and the other Pew data is showing the much faster growth. So it's not just a Pew thing, but this is an old Pew study in 2011. The Religious Landscape Study are those two studies in 2007 and 2014, and Pew has several others. You can also look at different churches will release numbers. The LDS Church has done so in their almanacs and their statistical reports. The Next Mormons was a great survey of Mormonism. The GSS has a really great data stream, and PRRI is also puts out they have a great data set for 2018, but they don't have longitudinal data that I can find going back further. But presumably they're going to do it again in 2019, so this is going to be a place to look to in the future, I think. But these are some of the places you can go if you're interested in kind of the raw data and looking at more of the data. So are there any burning thoughts, questions before we quit? Yeah, go ahead.
So the nuns are kind of unique in that, in the sense that they're not organized, they're not belongers. And so when they come out of that, let's say the mainline Christians and become, nuns, they're also lose whatever power they would have had as being a member of an organized group.
Right. So I think the comment was because the nuns are unorganized, they are less likely to have influence. And this is true. I think what we see is a waning of the influence of these religious groups, but the nuns don't necessarily pick up that influence all on their own because they're not organized in the same way. And so they have a disadvantage. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that the religious right, which is often used as evidence, against the secularization hypothesis, right? Because the religious right gained a great deal of power, political power in America's past. On the other hand, every single policy they advocated for has failed. Just think about that for a minute, right? They lost the culture wars. And you can see the religious right as, and this isn't an advocacy either. If you're someone watching one of my talks and you're a member of the religious right, this is something you should look at and face, because I'm not advocating for a position. I'm just stating what happened. And so the religious right was a reaction to secularization. So if you're talking about the secularization hypothesis, their existence isn't refutation of it. They're a reaction to it. And they wouldn't be there if it wasn't happening. And the fact that then they reacted to it and tried to create a backlash against it, tried to resist it, and then failed, is an indication that secularization is happening. Again, without saying whether that's good or bad, it's happening. And the religious right is actually evidence of it. Now, the only place where there's still ambiguity is abortion. Americans' views on abortion are still mixed, and they haven't changed much. But on all the others, women in the workplace, gay marriage, divorce, whether divorce should be easily obtainable, Americans' views are shifting and have shifted away from the religious rights position. And I think the election of Trump is evidence, to some extent, that they're still fighting, right? But they lost the general election, and they elected him because the college, the Electoral College, gives rural states an extra advantage. But they elected him, and they like him because he fights for them. And he fights for them because, and they want someone who is less, civil and more willing to fight, because they feel like they're losing. Right? It's this sense that gay marriage has been forced upon us, and now we have to bake cakes that we don't want to bake, whether our religion denies it or not. And these secular views are being forced on us, and we don't like it. That makes them want to react with someone who is less civil, frankly, more willing to argue, to debate, to stand up for their position. And they like it because finally someone is standing up to all this, secularization. But again, just like the religious right, if secularization wasn't happening, that isn't what we would expect Ronald Reagan. Trump is a reaction to something they don't like, because they don't like the fact that secularization has happened. So they're more willing to support someone like that. So again, I think that's an important. This whole thing provides important insight into what's happening in our society right now. Yeah.
You reminded me that in the Battle for God, Karen Armstrong proposed a theory that fundamentalism comes from fear of modernity. And she pointed out in the Abrahamic religions that when they were confronted with modernity, there a big crop of fundamentalism came as a backlash, and I think that's similar to what you're describing.
So I haven't actually read that particular book by Karen Armstrong, but the comment was that Karen Armstrong in the book, say it again for me, the Battle for God, argued that fundamentalism can be seen as a reaction to modernity, as a backlash to it.
Yeah, and it's based on fear.
A reaction to it based on fear. I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Muslim decrease, but they're not a monolithic thing. There are several groups like the Sunnis, the Shiites, who knows what other groups, there are some other groups, all seem to be at odds with each other. So I don't know how you lump them all together into a statistic.
Okay, so the comment was that the growth of the Muslims is difficult and inappropriate, possibly, to lump together into a single statistic, because the Muslim world is fractured. There are Shias and Sunnis and lots of different sects among the Shias and Sunnis. And so they aren't a monolithic group. In fact, some of those sects are diametrically opposed to each other, so it's wrong to take them all as a single group. That's correct. The same is true of the Hindus and the Christians, though. And so when you look at trends like this, you kind of, at some degree, have to say, I'm going to divide things up along some lines so that you can see what's happening. And so there are Christian sects that are diametrically opposed to each other as well, and yet we've lumped them all together too. Now we can break them out by all these subgroups, but when you do, the graph the figure is no longer interpretable. There's too many moving parts. But it's certainly true that the Muslim world is not united any more than the Christian world is, which prevents them from moving together. And it also creates some of the instability in the Middle East as they fight among themselves. So that's certainly relevant. And Christians have the same disagreement. The difference is we live in countries where we've decided that pluralism is a good thing, where religious tolerance and diversity is a good thing. For the most part, Christians live in places where we've made that decision. And so we're able to shoot at each other less because of our Christian divisions. That didn't used to be the case. In Christianity's past, we fought amongst ourselves every bit as much as the Muslims do. We just don't do it as much now. And again, that is the point of the secularization hypothesis. Right? Yeah.
Sort of an observation or a thought that kept coming to me is when you start predicting out to 2050, you're also predicting out to when climate change will start to have probably this enormous effect. And wealthy countries may respond differently to that to poor countries. Christian nations, who are primarily wealthy, may respond differently than some of the Muslim nations, like Indonesia. There's this huge variable wave coming that may have. I just wonder if different religious groups, because of where they're located, are going to have. It's going to have very different effect on their societies.
So here was the comment. I think it's a good one. These projections out to 2050, climate change is predicted to have some effect by then, but already has effect. But we're predicted to have some more serious effects, especially in terms of migration by then. And what does that do to these projections? The religious landscape study did not take any of that sort of thing into account. All they did was they said, this is the current migration rate, let's assume it continues. This is the current conversion rate, let's assume that continues. And they projected those things out. The further you project them out, the more likely those things are to be interrupted by changes, dramatic changes possibly caused by mass migration. And it doesn't have to be from global warming. The war in Syria caused a spike in Muslim migration to Europe. You can't predict that sort of thing. And there will be surprises. And so I think knowing the trends and where they're at right now is important, but we shouldn't assume that they're going to just continue. Now, it's important to track them out to 2050 so you see the slope, right? You see where we're headed. But that doesn't mean we're going to stay headed in the same direction for all those years. Surprises will come, migrations will come, and global warming is one of the possible things that could drive mass migration and really mix up some of these countries. So who knows what that will do? Yeah?
Do you think the Chinese treatment of Uyghurs is that an indication that they're going back to a more rigid approach, or is that?
I don't know what China's doing. So the question was, China has started to repress certain religious minorities, etc. Does that mean they're going back to? I don't know what China's going to do. Hong Kong is a huge issue. I can't predict. Well, all I can say is that in the past, China enforced secularization on their people, and now they actively suppress certain religious traditions that they consider subversive. But they are more tolerant of mainstream Christianity in some forms, and Buddhism being brought back in some forms, and they're still very repressive of certain religious traditions they consider subversive. So they control which religions are kind of allowed, but religion itself is at least allowed. And then again, what they're going to do in the future, I don't know what they're going to do in the future, and what the people are going to do. Are they going to convert to these religions? I don't. Or they stay secular? I don't know. So China is this big wild card, and it's billions of people worth of wild card. So who knows? Yeah.
Is the group that they have decided to respond against a group that is having lots of children?
I don't know. Yes? That would make some sense. I don't know enough about it, but I assume other people here can answer your question better than me. All right, is that it? This is an interesting topic. I think it's fascinating and we generated some good discussion. If there are any other questions before we go, all right, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you next time.